Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the paths between primary and secondary worlds. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey there, welcome back. Today we're going to be getting back to our book club on Augustine's Confessions, as I'm joined by Chase and Kyle to talk about books 5 and 6. But before we get there, I want to give you some quick updates. First of all, as a reminder, I am resurrecting my Substack on Tolkien's letters, which provides a brief summary and, more importantly, a reflection on each of Tolkien's letters. And now that I'm bringing that back, I'm doing so with the revised and the expanded edition of his letters. And so I'm going to go back and take a look at some of the new letters that I had missed the first time around with the old edition. And so that is starting up right away. I'm going to leave a link in the show notes. I said I was going to do that last time, but I don't think I did. So I'm actually going to leave that link in the show notes this time. Go ahead and subscribe to that so you don't miss it. Every other edition in that Substack series is free, and every other article is behind a small paywall of $5 a month. However, if you become a Tier 2 patron over here at Mythic Mind, then every Tuesday, you're going to get my reading of one of those articles. And so I need to do some catch up to get to where I am in the Substack, and so you might get some bonuses here and there as I catch up. But then you'll be getting on a weekly basis my reading of the latest Substack article, even those that are behind the paywall. And so if you are somebody who just really prefers reading, then you could subscribe to my Substack. $5 a month will get you access to all the articles. Or if you're somebody who likes to listen and you just want all the Mythic Mind stuff delivered into one single podcast feed, become a Tier 2 patron or higher over at patreon.com/mythicmind. And by the way, I'm talking about patronage. If you're listening to this when it comes out, know that I am currently running a special deal where the discount for annual patronage is bumped up to 25%. And if you get a Tier 3 annual patronage, then you get all podcasts, Substack stuff, all delivered early and ad-free into a single podcast feed. And you also get access to all of my courses that begin within this annual term. And so if you subscribe right now at that level, that would include Plato Stoicism Until We Have Faces, which begins at the beginning of August. In the fall, we have the Elder Scrolls and Philosophy. And then in early 2026, we're going to be taking a look at the Silmarillion. And so you can get all that right now at a discount by becoming an annual Tier 3 patron. And that really goes a long way in funding my efforts to keep doing things like this. And one last thing before we get into our conversation, with some of the various things that are happening right now, I've reworked the schedule a little bit. You may have noticed that this episode was released on a Monday as opposed to the regular Tuesday. And so moving forward, the main Mythic Mind podcast, this one right here, will be released publicly on Mondays. On Tuesday will be our Tier 2 patron and higher Substack readings. Every other Wednesday, we have our movies and shows podcast. And then currently, at least for a short time, every single Friday, we have an episode from the Mythic Mind Games podcast. It just so happened with the way schedule worked out with recordings and guests and whatnot that I ended up with a small stockpile of episodes. And so I decided to release those on a weekly basis for now. I would love to do all these podcasts on a weekly basis, maybe even more frequently than that. But I really would need the support to be able to turn away from other bill-paying endeavors to do that. And so if you want to help me to increase frequency on an ongoing basis, head over to patreon.com/mythicmind. But for now, you can, over on the Mythic Mind Games podcast, you can expect an episode every week, at least for a little while. All right. With all of that said, let's go ahead and get into our conversation with Chase and Kyle on Augustine's Confessions, books 5 and 6. Welcome back after about a month of a break there. Welcome to Chase and Kyle. And I guess we lost some people along the way. I guess, I don't know, they were too convicted. They just couldn't stand it anymore, dealing with these deep studies. But we are returning to talk about books 5 and 6 of Augustine's Confessions. I think I want to start off by just reading first, I don't know, half of the first paragraph or so to just set the tone, set the mood of what we're doing here. Augustine writes, "Receive the sacrifice of my confessions, offered by my tongue, which thou didst form and hast moved to confess unto thy name. Heal thou all my bones, and they shall say, Lord, who is like to thee? A man who makes confession to thee does not thereby give thee any information, as to what is happening within him. The closed heart does not close out thy eye, nor the heart's hardness resist thy hand. For thou dost open it at thy pleasure, whether for mercy or for justice, and there is nothing that can hide itself from thy heat. So he just starts off very similar to how he usually starts off these books, with, well, confessing himself before God, but also raising some of these questions. He kind of asking the question of, well, why am I making confessions to God who already knows what's going on in my own heart? And it's the kind of question that we've all probably thought about from time to time, of like, what's the point of praying to a God who already knows what we have to say? Right? There's that kind of intellectual problem there. Even Boethius deals with that question. What's the point of praying if God already knows what I'm going to pray? He knows what I have to say. And of course, the point is not to give God new information. The part is to humble yourself before God. And so he's really just orienting himself appropriately there as he is going to go on to detail how he was humbled, as he's been doing in various ways. Now he's going to really get into how he has been humbled intellectually as he is pulled by grace through this philosophical meandering. So it kind of sets the stage for what we're looking at in these in books 5 and 6. But love to hear from you guys. Kind of whatever you want to say to kick us off with book 5. Kyle, you want to take it?
Yeah. So my thoughts, I think, sometimes don't relate to each other as well as they should. But I thought the first paragraph is really dense with a lot of different insights. And one of the things that sucks me was, so the closed heart does not close out thy eye, nor the heart's hardness resist thy hand, for thou dost open it at thy pleasure, whether for mercy or for justice. And so for me, it's like, yeah, I think all the time about, all right, the my eyes have been enlightened such that I may like see and delight in the glory of God. And that's for mercy. And you have to remember, and he's kind of hitting on this key. It's like he could have continued in his blindness, maybe unto death, but his eyes would be opened at that point for justice, such that he would receive the wrath of God for eternity. And he kind of reflects on that later on when he's speaking about his illness in Rome as soon as he arrived, and he's praying a thanks to God for saving him from his first death as well as the second death, where he would have been under that wrath eternally. So that was the first thing that I really keyed in on that I thought was enlightening.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think later on kind of goes with this about how I think it's in the second paragraph. So they stumbled against the in their injustice and justly suffered, since they had withdrawn from thy mercy and stumbled against thy justice and fallen headlong upon thy wrath. And it's the same thing. Like there's really there's no escaping God. You know, whether like if you just think like you're not, hey, I'm not really about it. I don't want any of his love or anything like that. Well, you're still going to be confronted against him, you know?
Yeah, I mean, Augustine definitely throughout his writing, but we've already seen this in Confessions, how he really demonstrates the fact that God is in charge here. That Augustine wasn't saved through any merits of his own. He was saved despite himself. Like he's very clear about that. That he's thrown himself into all these different lusts. Within this reading, I don't know if it's book 5 or 6, but he starts to. I don't know if he's mentioned this before, but that he has this concubine that he's had for years now that he finally lets go when he's engaged to get married. He lets go of this woman that he's been with, but then he couldn't wait any longer, so he got another woman while he's still waiting. And so this is someone who's just been thrown into lust of the flesh. He's been thrown into lust of the mind as he's been dragged along by these cult leaders, these heretics, these vain philosophers. Um, Yet, despite all of these things, God has graciously been leading him along toward his home in the church. And so we just really see this idea that God is in charge, both in executing justice as well as in issuing out mercy, and that God will save those who he sets out to save.
Yeah, I think one of the things I saw here in the first couple paragraphs was just how creation, serves to glorify the creator. And he, at the end of this first paragraph, he talks about all the like man, animals, lifeless matter, everything praises the creator. And God doesn't desert anything that he has made.
Yeah. When he says the truth is that they fled, that they might not see thee who sawest them. And so with eyes blinded, they stumbled against thee, for thou dost not desert any of the things that thou hast made. And so that's exactly what you're saying. That God is he is the foundation for all of existence. Like there's nowhere we can flee from God. You go to the highest heavens, he's there. You go to Sheol, he's there. And so God is always present for those who turn to him and ask of his mercy. But of course, as Augustine mentioned earlier, it's the problem is that in our blindness, we celebrate our blindness as if it's a strength. And at that point, you're not going to ask to see, and therefore sight will not be granted to you. And so we very much see that sin, that misery in its various forms, is on us. Lewis talks about this in I think it might be The Great Divorce. He has this great line where he talks about how basically eternal joy is forever right in front of us. If only we would reach out for it. And we just we see that humbled spirit in Augustine, someone who has been crushed down, his pride's been crushed down, and he's been able to receive the mercy that's always being extended out to us.
It's interesting because, like, as you read Augustine's Confessions, you kind of see hints of some of the doctrines that he's coming up with. I remember, I think it was in book 4, he's like hinting at divine simplicity. And here, like, what's the line? God will not leave what he's created. I can't quote it. I know it's in the first paragraph. I'm not gonna spend too much time looking for it. But then later on, he's like struggling with the incarnation, right? That might be in book 5 or book 6, and he's saying, I can't come to like I was foolish in that I imagined evil as a substance. And so I can't bow to a God that has created this evil substance, right? Because then you can't be all good. And so he's saying that as like such that he eventually recognizes that it's wrong. He's hinting to the fact that he's recognizing it's a foolish thing to think. But even here, it's like God does not abandon his creation insofar as like for something to be creation, it can't be abandoned, right? Like it's there isn't without him. And so if you are going like there's no real sense of abandoning God, it's just blindness,
Yeah,
which seems to be what he talks about.
yeah, that's exactly right. It's exactly how he sees it. That I mean that evil for Augustine, that our evil sin is it's the problem isn't that we value things. The problem is that we value lesser things above the greater things, and in so doing, we move in the direction of non-being, and that's what sin is. That we're moving in the direction of non-being. We're trying to go where God isn't, but of course there is no such place. Where if we go there, God is there too because we are. Like you don't have existence without God, and so that's exactly right. And this is something that he struggled with. And in fact, it's something that the Romans in general tended to struggle with because they didn't have this idea of a truly transcendent God. Their gods very much dwelt on the same plane of existence as we do. They're just like superheroes, essentially. Like it's not that different than what you get in the Marvel version, which is dumbed down version, obviously, but metaphysically speaking, it's essentially the same thing. They just operate in a different realm of this plane of existence. And so when the Christians start talking about like we don't have we don't bow down to idols because well our God can't be that identify that well our God isn't intrinsically that localized. Like they accuse the Christians of being atheists because they simply had no way of understanding the idea of a purely spiritual, truly transcendent God that transcends this material realm. And Augustine seemed to kind of imbibe some of that difficulty, which is one of the reasons why he latched on to the Manichaeans, because they at least had some idea of like good and evil that made sense to him with his Roman upbringing. And of course, their idea being kind of this yin and yang idea of sorts, that good and evil are constantly at contest with each other, and that the material is the world of sense experience is like inherently flawed or drawn down to evil, which obviously is not a Christian position, but it is something that philosophically he had to overcome on this journey.
Yeah, and keeping all that in mind, you see him speak redemptively of creation, even though it is slashed on by sin, because he speaks of we are helped upward by the things thou hast made, and passing beyond them unto thee who hast wonderfully made them. So you have The our passions are is a ladder to our love for God, right? And so things aren't bad in and of themselves, but they are lesser than. But respected rightfully, they are wayposts on the way to a love for God.
Yeah, in fact, it is his appreciation of the natural world that in part started to cause some doubts toward the Manichaeans, because the things that he was learning about, like the way that the world works on a very natural, what we would call scientific level, that it just didn't seem to match up with the things that he was learning from the Manichaeans. So there was this contradiction between what we would identify as the book of nature versus the book of Revelation that he was using. And so you start to see there's this disconnect here, that the philosophers that I esteem, the philosophers who seem to have a decent grasp on the way that the world works on a mechanical level, like this isn't matching up with what my Manichaean teachers are telling me. And so that started to instill some doubts that like maybe there's not as much substance here as I once thought. And eventually, the head Manichaean guy, this Faustus, he comes. And first, Augustine's really excited about meeting this great teacher who has inspired so many. But then he finally gets to talk with the guy, and he recognizes he doesn't really know anything. And so it's just empty. It's just empty substance. It's empty kind of theological jargon, but there's no reality behind it. And so then he starts to become more inclined toward the classical philosophers at that point, which is kind of part of his movement ultimately in the direction of the church.
Augustine is the king of the humble brag, or you have this world-renowned teacher, and Augustine finally meets him. He's like, dude, you're actually just not that smart.
Well, I mean, Augustine, I mean, this is the guy who previously told us that he read Aristotle. And, he didn't understand why
Yeah,
everyone else had a hard
yeah,
time with him.
yeah, that's true. 2 weeks in a row. Just the king of the humble brag. Yeah, but even more so, I don't know, he just really hammers home on it. Like it seems like there's a few things to know about Augustine that unlocks all the text. Because at the end of what is it, book two of what's book five? I don't know how to read the headings. But he says, "But where was I when I sought after thee? Thou wert there before me, but I had gone away from myself, and I could not even find myself, much less thee." So there, I'm afraid to butcher him when paraphrasing him, but he speaks of it as though he's wandering away from himself.
Mhm.
Those are the terms he uses. Not that he's wandering away from God, but that he's wandering away from himself.
Right, because ultimately that's one and the same. I mean, if to Kierkegaard, he has this great line in one of his journals when he says, um, with God's help, I shall become myself." This idea that I'm only truly myself, the ideal version of me, which is another way of saying the true version of me, when I am standing before God. Like that, we are made in His image. We're made to reflect who God is, and when we're not doing that, we're living as shadow versions of ourselves, which is very Platonic language. And also, I mean, that's what we get in the Great Divorce, the difference between the ghosts and the solid spirits, that the ghosts are shadow versions of what a human is supposed to be. And so to flee from God as an image bearer of God is to flee from yourself, who you are, who you're designed to be. And in so doing, you in turn become, well, you become darkened, you become shadowy, you become less substantial and more frivolous. And so he is obviously somebody who's been looking for what is substantial. He's starting to have some doubts in the Manichaeans. He's starting to recognize that there's more value to be found in the classical philosophers, which, it was Cicero who really launched him on his philosophical quest. That, when he's studying Cicero for rhetoric, he recognized that Cicero is actually saying some significant things, that there's some actual wisdom there beyond how he's saying it. And so there's always been this spark in him of like, I want to actually get to the root of things. I want substance. I don't just want the veneer, which is perhaps kind of ironic given that I mean, he's a master of rhetoric, right? Like he is somebody who you would think would be consumed with how things are said, but all along on his philosophical journey, he wants to know that the substance behind things. He wants to know the capital W word behind words. And so he shifts toward the philosophers, but even then, um, he recognizes that they can only go but so far. He says that they can calculate an eclipse, but they don't recognize that they themselves are eclipsed. They can study the light, but they don't understand what actually produces the light. They can't get beneath the surface. It reminds me of in Till We Have Faces, this idea that we eventually you reach a level where foxes can no longer dig, right? Where he's looking for something that now even the great philosophers, what they are incapable of approaching. And ultimately, he's looking for God, whether he knows it or not at this time in his life.
Augustine is an expert at putting down just like how everything serves God's purpose and seeing different things that happen through his life that pushed him on the way. When he says at the end of, I guess, chapter 7, book 5, it says, Thus uh, Faustus, who had been a snare that brought death to many, did without his knowledge or will begin to unbind the snare that held me. And then later he goes on about, um, in the next paragraph, um, but you, O my hope and my portion in the land of the living, force me to change countries for my soul's salvation. You pricked me with such goads at Carthage as drove me out of it, and you set before me certain attractions by which I might be drawn to Rome. It's like using just frustration at one's job to like push one towards salvation and God's purpose. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah, I love that line of providence. That even as he's detailing, you've got the wickedness of Faustus, this guy who he says has led so many people astray into death, but yet that served as part of his journey to get him to where he needs to go. Because Faustus is the one who actually disenchanted Augustine, right? Allowed him to kind of move away from the Manichaeans, and then he moves away from Carthage, basically because his students are really annoying.
Yeah,
He they basically show up whenever they want to. That they're just not really focused. I mean, and so he wants to go somewhere where he feels like he's going to get some measure of respect, that there's going to be an expectation of discipline. He wants to move into a better school district, essentially. Which well, maybe I shouldn't comment on that. So he wants to go somewhere where he can just focus on teaching, and so he goes to Rome. Um, but even that only lasts but so long. I mean, he does well enough there, but eventually he's inclined to move away from there as well because, in part, his students weren't paying him, so he's still having a problem with his students. And so then he moves off to Milan, where he's going to meet Ambrose, which is going to be a fundamental step in his conversion story. Because Ambrose is really going to be the one who's going to lead him into the faith, and so he really just details how between his own kind of sinful impulses and frustrations, the fact that he lied to his mom when he ran off to Rome, like I mean, not a lot of commendable stuff going on here, but he recognizes that his own sin, as well as just the frustrations and sin around him, it's all bringing him exactly where it is that he needs to be.
I love the way he describes like his mom throughout these two books, where he said, "You did not do what she was at that moment asking, that you might do the thing she was always asking." Just meaning like didn't keep him from Rome because he was meant to go there, but the thing that she's always been asking for, praying for, is his salvation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, same kind of idea there, but just from her perspective that um, God didn't give her what she was asking for. He didn't give her consolation then and there so that she could get the ultimate consolation. Just another emphasis on the sovereignty of God over our temporal, fleeting thoughts and feelings. I should mention that in the midst of all these changes in his life, for a little bit of time, after starting to part ways with the Manichaeans, he starts to team up with the academics, which this was a group of philosophers that actually descended from Plato's Academy, although they have a very different orientation than Plato did. And so things have, well, it's the long defeat. Things have fallen apart over time. And so now these academics are basically just the skeptics of the age, when they say, you really can't know anything, that there's no truth to be known.
So I didn't know that academics was a term for a school of philosophy. So, but I read the line, what I thought to be the manner of the academics, that is to say, doubting of all things and wavering between one and another. And I just thought it was funny. I thought it was
No, I mean, it works for the natural reading in today, today's academic climate. I mean, as somebody who teaches in the humanities, that this is basically it. Like there is no truth. Like, or if there is, we can't really know it. Who's to say? It's all subjective. There's no reality that we can actually talk about meaningfully. And so even if we just treat that as a kind of a normal term, it definitely works. But I should bring up that Augustine talks a lot more about the academics in City of God in one section. And I mentioned this in the brief history of ideas course recently, but when you get to Rene Descartes, who is trying to find some truth that he knows with absolute certainty, he says, "I'm going to doubt everything I could possibly doubt because I want to build up my philosophy on some truth I couldn't be wrong about." And so he whittles down all the things he could doubt, and I could doubt whether or not I'm awake or I'm sleeping. Like I don't really know. I could be asleep right now dreaming. My sense experience could be deceiving me. Maybe I'm getting fed some wrong information, Matrix style. Like he wants to create the worst possible scenario so that way he can find something he's certain about. And what he concludes is, I think, therefore I am. Because I'm thinking, I know I must exist in some capacity. And that's what he knows with certainty. And he kind of treats this like it's this novel philosophical innovation he came up with. But in reality, it comes straight from Augustine's argument against the academics. In City of God, Augustine says that the academics say you can't really know any truth. Well, but the problem is, if I doubt, I know that I exist in some capacity. And so in Augustine's argument against the academics, I mean, he basically lays out what Descartes just copies over and doesn't give credit for. So just another argument against modern philosophy, and all that's worthwhile you can find in the pre-moderns. But
That
that's kind of a
sounds
side note.
that sounds a little personal coming.
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit of pent-up irritation.
Yeah, I definitely think from the modern period on, from Descartes on, things tend to go downhill.
I did because we're talking about the way that God directs the steps of Augustine for his salvation. And so at the end of chapter 7 of book 5, I'll just read it because it's what we're doing. And it's the last line I really like. For thy hand, O my God, and the secret of thy providence did not desert my soul. From the blood of my mother's heart, sacrifice for me was offered thee day and night by her tears, and thou didst act with me in marvelous ways. For it was thou, my God, who didst do it. For with the Lord shall the steps of a man be directed, and he shall like well his way. How shall we attain salvation unless by thy hand thou dost remake what thou didst make? And we're talking about like the way to know God is through humility. He speaks about that again and again. The philosophers can't know God because they won't think little of themselves. They need to think of themselves highly. And in this uh, autobiography of Augustine, he's constantly talking about the way God has humbled him. And God is like God has made Augustine's intellect for great things. Yet in order for God to remake Augustine, he needs to tear it down and he needs to demonstrate like you are great, but you are only what I make you in order for that action to be completed.
Yeah, in over in book 6, he really emphasizes just how weak we are. With his incident with his buddy Alypius, who who had turned away from the games, the gladiatorial games, recognizing that this is just violence, is carnage. Like there's nothing redemptive about this, and so he turns away from it. But then his friends say, "Nah, come on over." Like, he says, even if you drag me there, like I'm not going to look. And they say, "Okay, well, let's put that to the test." And so, his buddies drag him to the arena so that he can test his resolve to not participate. But then the crowd start going. He kind of falls into the crowd. He loses his individuality with the groupthink, which is so easy to do, right? When everyone's getting riled up about something, it's easy to just join with the crowd. And so he starts to fall into this bloodlust with the crowd. And so now he's just fallen right back into these carnal passions. But then Augustine talks about how Alypius was falsely accused of theft, and he kind of just goes through this redemption arc about how this guy, he falls, he has this false accusation levied against him, but kind of through all of this, he's brought up and sort of restored, not only politically, but more importantly, restored spiritually. And so, in this kind of side incident, looking at his buddy in Milan, um, that we see just this. Again, we see the weakness of our carnal nature, but the sovereign redemption of God that often takes what we might consider unlikely means to accomplish its purposes, much as we see in the life of Augustine, just now brought down to the microcosm level with this case of this guy he knew.
Yeah, Augustine is also intentional to point out that in the case of Alypius, the the Reformation took time, right? We have the gladiatorial incident, and then Alypius is inviting his friends there, and he's all in it now. He's fallen into that lust, and now he's gripped by the lust. And Augustine says, yeah, out of all of this, you drew him with strong and merciful hand, teaching him to have confidence in you, not in himself, him having confidence in himself being why he failed. And then Augustine says, but this was long after. So it's not a quick fix, but with Alypius as well, and as we see through Augustine's biography, like God is taking his time to humble the people that he draws to himself. Because you can't go to God unless you have humility. And it can take time to cultivate that.
Yeah, and that, I mean, it should give us some hope, not only for ourselves and our own failings, but I think even more fundamentally for those that those that we care about, like those that we pray for. And it seems like nothing's happening. The reality is, we don't know God's timing. We don't know God's sovereignty. All we know, hopefully, what we know is God's mercy, and like that's all we can rely on. And I think that is another good example of that. Yeah, just jumping, I mean, kind of all over these sections here. In his conversations with Ambrose, I think it's worth noting that he initially was drawn into this relationship with Ambrose not because of Ambrose's theology or his philosophy, but because, well, Augustine says because he was kind. Like it was just his kindness that drew him in initially. And then as they form this relationship, he starts to go listen to Ambrose's sermons. Now, at that point, he still isn't drawn into the actual theology or substance of the sermons. He is drawn at that point by Ambrose's rhetoric, that as a teacher of rhetoric, he recognizes Ambrose speaks very well, and so he's drawn into that. And so, I mean, it's it's like he's drawn into all these surface level things, but in so doing, he ends up finding substance. And I don't really know what to make of that. It kind of sounds like I just made a case for seeker sensitivity, which I don't really
Well,
like that, but
my thought was that it's a case in point of what we were talking about earlier with the passions being a ladder to God, right? Because like he is, I think you can say he has a passion for rhetoric, clearly. And so he's constantly seeking out these teachers. And whether it's Ambrose or whether it's Cicero, he encounters things which are true and thus bring him higher to the truth.
yeah, I think that's a good point. That he was in Ambrose speaking well, like that is it's a good thing. Like beauty is good, right? Beauty of words is a good thing, and that is a good thing that Augustine was latching on to. Even if it's not the highest thing, it is a good thing. That, as you said, it's a ladder bringing him somewhere significant. And so I think it has more to say with the reality of beauty, the reality of goodness, than it does with Ambrose, so to speak. In other words, Ambrose isn't trying to construct a scenario to make people feel comfortable. He's engaging in beautiful and good things that speak to the souls of those who are looking in the direction of something that is good and beautiful.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what is good is beautiful and is true, right? Because all of these
Right.
things are those transcendental attributes. And with Augustine, like you also always notice, like he feels the tension with falsehood. Whether it's the falsity of it, whether it's the ugliness of it, whether it's the badness of it. He's always saying like these things never left me content. He doesn't find contentment until he finds truth.
Right. And at least looking back, he recognizes that that's why all these things were empty because he wasn't finding Christ. And in his conversation with Ambrose, he recognizes that the Christian faith that he had rejected for so long is actually not the Christian faith. He had this caricature of what Christianity actually teaches. But as he got into the substance of that and kind of unraveled that a little bit, suddenly the scriptures became far deeper than he recognized. Um, it makes me think of, I'll say the evangelical types who say, well, I grew up in church, therefore I know what they teach, right? I know what they say, I know what happens there. When most of the time they have no idea what Christianity is, right? The people who are most vocal in their dissent from Christianity, typically speaking, they really don't know what Christianity is. They don't know what it is that they've rejected. And I think Augustine is really coming out and recognizing just that he spent so long with this prejudice toward Orthodox Catholic teaching that now he's recognizing he hasn't actually rejected Christianity. He's rejected his understanding of what Christianity is, which is a very different thing.
Yeah, I think I haven't. So I'm gonna. Well, I'll be honest. I haven't read a lot of Augustine. I've heard lots of things about Augustine, and from what I've heard about his belief in creation has always been really fascinating to me. In terms of just like he sees the spider eating the fly, and he's like, there is an inherent goodness, there is an inherent beauty in this thing that's happening. Like the spider was clearly made to do this. It's fulfilling its natural purpose. And so to then presume that this only occurred later in a what's the term, post-lapsarian world is foolish, maybe in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, Augustine Augustine's understanding of creation is not in line with your typical 21st century fundamentalist. That Augustine, and we'll get to this at the end of the Confessions. We start to move away from autobiography to really getting into his understanding of the Genesis account of creation, and so we'll get into this in more detail. But Augustine supposes that, well, maybe God didn't make everything finish, that maybe he basically created the seeds of creation that took time to develop. And so he definitely would be what we would call an old earth creationist by today's standards. The difference, of course, being that Augustine, he's not
That's why the
relying,
evangelicals don't like him.
yes, that I mean, people will even use Augustine try to argue for like theistic evolution. I mean, not that he's going to speak in those terms because he's not dealing with modern science, but when he talks about God creating seeds of creation that progress over time to the world that we have today, like philosophically, that case can be made. I'm not saying it has to be made, but like the point is that he is not a literalist in the way that he approaches the creation account. In fact, that's part of what he got from Ambrose, learning how to interpret the Old Testament allegorically.
Yeah, I think it's a good example of how maybe my phraseology will be bad, but there can be a good kind of deconstruction, right? Like we live in that ex-evangelical world where deconstruction is a really dirty term, but it is good to think about like, all right, what is the scripture actually saying? Like what points is it making? What points is it not making? And I'm reading into it.
Yeah. And I think that it's very important that we understand scripture in its original context and ask the question, why was it written? That's going to be a different question. That's going to lead to a different answer than simply looking at it from a 21st century lens and asking, what does it seem to be saying right now to our current context? Because obviously all scripture does speak to our current context, but we have to filter it through, what was the original intention here? And when Augustine, kind of led by Ambrose, when he looks at the Genesis creation account, his first response is not that he's getting a literalistic, scientific, materialistic account of how things came to be. What he recognizes, or what he comes to understand, is that what we're getting is a theological message. And so, in the way that we are interpreting the Genesis account, like we need to understand not just what's happening on a literal level, but like what does this mean? What is this revealing about who God is? And when that takes a primary level reading, well, it may lead to some different conclusions than you might get otherwise. I feel like I'm going to be pleasing and upsetting a number of people right now.
It's all right. You're safe with me.
At the beginning of um, book six, I do like the story about his mom traveling through the dangerous storm, and reassuring the sailors, kind of just like maybe think of like Paul almost, just like it's all going to be all right.
Right,
Uh,
right. When Paul's like, I have to go to Rome, so we're going to make it.
yeah, stay with the ship. That's the only way.
Yeah, his mom sounds like an extraordinary person, to say the
She
least.
must have been a fascinating woman.
Yeah.
And the
But
devotion that
even
she has to her son is
Hmm.
incredible.
and she even got so much from Ambrose, like just doing what she was like the custom that she was going to do, and then hearing Ambrose say like, "Hey, that's shouldn't be doing that," and then she just like flipped on a dime and was like, "All right, you're right," you know, rather
I,
than, "Oh, this is the way that I've always done it." It's like, no, listen to somebody that may know better.
Right.
I can't imagine what her anxiety must have been like just having this son who is a genius and him being an unsaved person, and she knows it. And she just is constantly waiting to find somebody that can speak on the same level as her son. And for 30 years, she just never gets that until eventually she finds Ambrose. And Augustine says, like, yeah, she had a deep love for him. And I wonder what that must have felt like for her.
Yeah. I mean, even when he was with the Manichaeans, right? She's like trying to get people to just go talk to him. And now she finally found somebody who's able to reach out to him.
I mean, that was kind of, I guess, like coming from like a public school mindset or like a even non-denominational, very like shallow church to a more like structured church. It's like, oh, it's kind of the same thing, like I know that my parents had wanted me to like meet these people, know these people, talk to different, like more intellectually about stuff like this. And it took a long time, and then you're like, maybe I'm just the one that's wrong and I just need to like cool off a little bit. And then you finally find it. And
Yeah. Yeah. And so he does he finds it, right? He finds the substance that he's looking for. Um well, kind of. He's still keeping
Not quite there
himself at
yet.
arm's length, right?
Yeah.
He's still keeping himself away a little bit. Even at the point where he becomes a catechumen, and so he starts to recognize that there's wisdom here. Like there's something significant. This is something like what I'm looking for. However, doesn't really have like a moral conversion yet. It's very much an intellectual conversion at this point, where he recognizes that there's some wisdom here. He likes what he's hearing. That there's more substance here than he gets even in the pagan philosophers that he's admired up to this point. And so he recognizes something here, but it's still very cerebral. It's very philosophical. Um, he still has his his mistress. He hasn't really changed his life at all. It's all just intellectual at this point. The heart conversion will come in the next reading.
Yeah, I to jump around again, because we're talking about the heart conversion getting there. In chapter 6 of book 6, we have the story of him passing by the beggar, right? And so it's like he has to deliver a speech, which is a bunch of lies, and he knows they're lies, and everyone that's going to listen to it knows that they're lies, but they're all going to do the speech anyway. And he's dreading the experience, to the point where he sees the beggar on the side who's just, I don't know, wine drunk, right? And is having a good time asking people for pennies and panhandling. And so he's wondering just what do I have that is greater than what he has? Because
Right.
this person is experiencing joy, whereas I'm not.
Right. He says like this drunk beggar on the street, he has a greater measure of joy than I do as this great teacher of rhetoric who's about to give a speech to the emperor of Rome. Like it doesn't get much more prestigious than that. Yet he recognizes that he's walking around in despair. Like he has all the things he's been looking for, but he recognizes he doesn't have the things he's been looking for. And now, I mean, to be fair, he does state that, like, certainly this drunk beggar's joy is not true joy, but it's at least closer, I suppose, than what Augustine is experiencing.
yeah, kind of a wake up call when there's the beggar with like the beer in a paper bag is having a better joy than you are, even if it's not real.
Yeah, but it's it is the depths of hedonism, right? Because he starts out that chapter saying, I was hot for honors, money, and marriage. And you made mock of my hotness. You prevented me from taking delight in anything not yourself. And so ultimately, like if you're chasing those empty joys, like you're what does make you better than the beggar who's actually happy, even if it is just from wine, right? If you're warm and sad, but he's cold and happy, like you're a hedonist chasing after joy. He has it. You don't.
Right, you're just a bad hedonist. Um, and so I mean ultimately, of course, his despair, the fact that he was unable to achieve the hedonistic pleasures that he was pursuing, is itself a gift. It is the grace of God, giving him this despair, right, preventing him from achieving happiness in the things he was falsely seeking happiness in. And he even somewhere in here he gives a little jab at Epicurus, who is one of the major hedonists of the classical era. And basically, he's basically saying that he was being a bad hedonist, that he was pursuing pleasure but not finding it. But ultimately, him not finding pleasure is because God was calling him to himself. His heart was restless until it rests in God. Kierkegaard talks about this a lot. There's a lot of connections thematically between Kierkegaard and Augustine. And Kierkegaard talks about how um, despair is not something any of us want, but often it's exactly what we need. Like we need to recognize the emptiness of latching ourselves onto things that are here today and gone tomorrow, latching ourselves onto fading circumstance, which brings us back to Boethius, and that what we need to do is to find the eternal good, the good that makes good things good. And so that despair can actually be a gift. Anything else we didn't mention that you feel like is worth bringing up here? I still think it's just really lame how he gets set up to get married, but I mean the girl he's engaged to is not old enough to get married yet, so he's got to wait a couple of years. And in the meantime, um, he sends away his concubine, who is also the mother of his child. And then he just can't wait to get married, and so he picks up a new mistress. I don't really know what's happening with his child at this point, but it's like I don't I don't have a lot of sympathy for him in all of this, and I don't think he would for himself either, looking back, which I guess is the point of redemption.
He was a ladies' man.
He was, which likely feeds into some of the things he says about celibacy and sexual relations, even within marriage later on. How I feel like a lot of what he ends up saying later on, in I'm sure my Catholic friends might disagree with me on this, but in the things he has to say about celibacy, I think a lot of that probably is maybe an overreaction to some of his own experience, because that really was his chief temptation.
That's all I have.
I think it's I only have one last comment,
Hmm.
but I think that Alypius acts in a way as a mirror to Augustine. Because there are two people that are really just going through the same struggle, but here Augustine is able to observe it externally rather than internally. And so far as Alypius is a talented young person that is struggling with these worldly desires, um, and they're keeping him away from the truth, even though there is a real zeal for the truth.
Yeah, I think that they're good. It's a good companion story to the broader story that we're getting of Augustine himself. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it. I'm gonna end with the last bit of book 6 here. Um, Woe to my soul with its rash hope of finding something better if it forsook thee. My soul turned and turned again, on back and sides and belly, and the bed was always hard. For thou alone art her rest, and behold, thou art close at hand, to deliver us from the wretchedness of error, and establish us in thy way, and console us with thy word. Run. I shall bear you up, and bring you and carry you to the end. Just a good summary of the things that we've been discussing. That there is rest, going back to his opening of book 1, that there is rest only in God, and that our only hope of finding that rest is to run, right? Run from our temptation to sin, the lust of the flesh, the delights of the eyes, and run to the one place where we can find eternal rest. And that is where God will carry us unto the end. All right. Well, we will wrap there. Next time, we will cover books 7 and 8 as he deals with some more philosophical problems. We get a conclusion to his relationship with astrology, and we actually get to his heart conversion to the Christian faith. But until then, Godspeed. All right. Thank you for listening. As a reminder, currently running a deal over on Patreon. Annual discounts are bumped up to 25% for a short time. I originally said that was going to go till the end of June, but since I'm just announcing this in the podcast, I'll give it another week. And so through the end of the first week in July, I'll keep that deal going, become an annual patron today. And by the way, the good news is that when you become an annual patron at a discount, you actually get to keep that discount when you renew next year. And so it's a good deal beyond just this term. And again, becoming a patron gives you access to all the 3 podcasts delivered into one patron feed early and ad-free. But if you don't become a patron right now, then make sure that you are subscribed to all 3 of our podcasts right now: Mythic Mind Movies and Shows, and Mythic Mind Games. This is an exciting time in Mythic Mind, and I want to thank all my patrons because it really means a lot to me that we've been able to go this far and that we have even more goals on the horizon. And so many thanks to all patrons, and I want to thank by name all tier 3 patrons and higher. And so that is Mark, Amanda, Chase, Chaz, Christopher, Clinton, David, Don, Aaron, Evie, Adam, Jack, Jamie, Justin, Kyle, Paul, Roger, Ross, Tyler, and William. So thank you so much to all tier 3 patrons. Thank you to all patrons. This is a growing community. Overall, we have over 60 members now. And so we continue to grow, and I hope that you will consider becoming part of this community. But that's it for now. If you're listening to this on the public feed, the next thing to be released is, Return of the Jedi on Wednesday over on the Mythic Mind Movies and Shows podcast. So check us out there. Until next time, Godspeed. I have always, at least ever since I can remember, had a kind of longing for death. It was when I was happiest that I longed most. It was on happy days when we were up in the hills, the 3 of us, with the wind and the sunshine, where you couldn't see Gloam or the palace. Do you remember? The color and the smell, and looking across at the gray mountain in the distance. And because it was so beautiful, it set me longing, always longing. Somewhere else there must be more of it. Everything seemed to be saying, "Psyche, come." But I couldn't come, and I didn't know where I was to come to. It almost hurt me. I felt like a bird in a cage when the other birds of its kind are flying home. And now I will make answer to you, O my judges, and show that he who has lived as a true philosopher has reason to be of good cheer when he is about to die, and that after death he may hope to receive the greatest good in the other world. For I deem that the true disciple of philosophy is likely to be misunderstood by other men. They do not perceive that he is ever pursuing death and dying. And if this is true, why, having had the desire of death all his life long, should he regret the arrival of that which he has always been pursuing and desiring? The longing of Plato and the control of the Stoics pervades Lewis's retelling of the Cupid and Psyche myth until we have faces. With this incredible novel, which he believed to be his best, Lewis demonstrates the tensions in ancient thought and, even more significantly, the limits of rational philosophy, which can only go as deep as the foxes can dig. Beyond that, under that, and providing the life of that thought, we find the dark and holy places that blind our faculties of reason. What then shall we do? This is a topic that we will explore after first surveying some important philosophical contributions in the ancient world that have had some significant bearing on Lewis's great novel. To this end, we will begin with Plato's Phaedo, which discusses the immortality of the soul and what those who love wisdom might expect in the life to come. And then we will spend 4 weeks with some of the great Stoics, including Epictetus, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca. Finally, we will turn our attention to Till We Have Faces for the final 2 weeks with original content, and so this will not be the same as what you may have seen in the Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis course. Each week of this 8-week study will include readings from primary sources that will be provided as PDFs, although these are all texts that belong in your personal library. You'll be provided with recommendations for secondary readings, you'll have recorded presentations for you to watch at your leisure, ongoing Discord chats, and weekly live meetings to discuss the readings. Enroll today by going to patreon.com/mythicmind and checking out the shop, or you can gain access to all courses, past, present, and future this year by purchasing a Tier 3 annual subscription. I hope to see you there.